Hello, and welcome to Ethanol Producer Magazine podcast. I am your host, Katie Schroeder, Associate Editor of EPM. Today I have with me Logan Leduc, Senior Carbon Consultant with EcoEngineers. And I'm so excited to kind of dig into life cycle carbon analysis with Logan today. Welcome, Logan. Excited to have you.
Thank you, Katie. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so just to get us started, could we talk a little bit about what is the purpose of a CI score?
So CI scores can sound fairly complicated, but they're really quite simple. It's a measure of how much carbon dioxide equivalent is being emitted to the atmosphere over the life cycle of a product like a fuel. So if you think about it, it's almost like your trash bill for how much trash you throw away, and it's atmospheric trash you're tossing here. So if you think about each step in the production process, there's emissions, and those emissions go to the atmosphere, and they form the basis of a CI score.
Awesome. Thank you for that good, solid definition to get us started on here. So I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about what are some of the life cycle models that are commonly used across the industry.
Right. So you tend to have different models depending on the different regulated environments that you fit into. If you're going into the US, typically you're going to be talking about the GREET model. And the GREET model is sort of the grandfather of most of the models used in the US context. So you've got the Argonne GREET model, and then you've got its sort of child or grandchild models in the California GREET model, which takes elements of the larger GREET model and adapts them for a California specific purpose. So you've got GREET, California GREET, and now you've got smaller offshoots in Oregon and Washington for some of these other emerging low carbon fuels programs. Then, if you go north of the border into Canada, you have something like the Fuel LCA model, which is a different basis from GREET developed completely independently. And you also have GH Genius, which is used at some of the provincial levels.
Got it. Yeah. I'm really curious if you could talk a little bit about within the ethanol industry, how do you calculate like an ethanol producer's greenhouse gas emissions? And then how does that information that you've gathered kind of translate into a CI score, a quick cut and dry number you can give?
Yeah, it may be one number, but it actually represents contributions from multiple small stages across the entire life cycle. So the first part of the chain is feedstock production. You'll have a number associated with the farming, growing of a crop, such as corn or soybean. You then have transportation of that feedstock through a couple of handlers, perhaps, to a biorefinery or an ethanol plant, for instance. That ethanol plant transforms raw corn into starch and then into ethanol. And over the course of that process, uses natural gas, electricity, some enzymes, and things like that. That ethanol then gets transported further downstream and is blended with gasoline in ethanol's case. And then it's then burned in your tank after you pump and fill your car up with it. So each of those individual life cycle stages has a greenhouse gas emission or a GHG emission intensity. And that's the score for each of those little pieces. You add those up, and that becomes the CI score that you report as one single number under any of the given regulations.
So I would love to just kind of hear a little bit about what the process looks like for gathering data from each of those individual steps.
Sure thing. So, data gathered for corn farming, for instance, that's done at a national average, and it's done from USDA surveys and a few other data sets that happen sort of annually or biannually. And the data is collected and interpreted and pulled into the model and summed up as one value that all the corn farmers in the US use towards their CI score. Now, the ethanol plants are treated on an individual basis. So you start to collect data on the actual amount of natural gas that they burn for heat in the facility or for drying of co-products. You meter the actual amount of electricity. So you actually look at the electricity bills for the facility. You look at other smaller things like bills for enzymes and chemical additives, but those don't have a very big contribution when you look at, the end product ethanol. And then you look at metered amounts of ethanol that are actually produced, how much denaturant is added to those ethanol gallons. And step by step along the process, if you add something or you alter something, you've got a physical record of it or some data that's attached to it in some type. So all of these little pieces of data get collected together and massaged together in spreadsheets, and it makes it sound and look a lot more intimidating than it actually is once you've played around with it. But your spreadsheet spits out a number that's just added up all of these small contributions along the way.
Awesome. Kind of what variation is there like between different models? Like how does the type of data that you're looking at vary depending on the model? Or I guess do the base values that you're working with change depending on what model you're looking at?
What typically happens is the models are adjusted for the regulatory environment they're used in. So you're collecting largely the same amounts of base data, but you have slightly different rules that are applied to that data after you've collected it. So the raw information itself, your electricity bill, your natural gas bill, your transportation distances, those aren't going to change. You're always going to collect those. How you treat them afterwards may change because you may have a different emission factor associated with the distance to it in one regulation versus another. GREET might say transporting corn is zero point 0.5 grams of CO2 per ton kilometer the corn travels. California may say, well, the distance traveled for corn entering a refinery that comes to California is going to be a little bit greater. So we're going to apply a zero point 0.7 to that same zero point zero 0.05 that GREET used. So you have changes in emission factors and you have changes in data treatment, but the raw data itself stays largely the same.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So does CI matter to the same degree under the renewable fuel standard compared to the low carbon fuel standard in California?
They don't actually. The way renewable fuel standards are constructed, you have a blending mandate. So the big thing that matters is the number of liters of fuel that are produced. You may use a CI score to determine if a fuel qualifies to participate in the program, but it doesn't necessarily impact what happens afterwards. So you qualify, you get in the program, you generate a credit based on the number of liters or gallons you're producing. A low carbon fuel program does kind of the opposite. So you get paid based on the performance of that fuel in the system. So the CI makes more difference there because what you're going to do is generate a credit based on the difference between the carbon intensity and the target for the program. And you're really measuring total emission reductions in those cases instead of just total liters produced. So they get used in both programs, but they get monetized kind of differently.
Right. So what I'm hearing is like the RFS is more like you're in or you're out, and the LCFS is how much credit are we giving you? Is that a fair way of describing that difference?
Yeah, that's a fair way of describing it. The renewable fuel standards and the renewable blending requirements, you get a pass or a fail, you're in the program, you're not, you're in a category, a D1, a D2, a D3, and so on, or not. And then it becomes just volume generated. Whereas low carbon fuel standards, it's strictly based on performance. So you can have smaller volumes with really low CI generating a very large number of credits because it's a really high performing situation.
Hmm. Yeah, cool. I'm really curious, I guess, how often do ethanol producers need to update and kind of reassess their CI scores? How often do they need to do that under different programs? And I guess, are there any kind of inciting incidents that you would maybe recommend the producer kind of reassess their CI score after, say, adding a new technology or some other type of event of that nature?
The clauses to sort of resubmit or to submit a new CI score really do vary by regulation. So, sort of the first trigger you get is, did the model get updated that's being used in the regulation? Did they move from a version 3 to a version 4? Did they issue an updated guidance and ask everybody to resubmit? So, that's the first sort of large trigger. The sort of second tier then becomes process improvements. And you're a little bit more limited there in that they don't want you to reapply for a CI every time you make a zero point zero 0.01 CI improvement. they've got criteria that's set differently in each regulation, but a nice number of like 2 grams or 5% of your previous total. If your CI has changed substantially in sort of those magnitude of numbers, then it's in your interest to resubmit because you're now potentially generating more credit for the same fuel because you're doing it more efficiently, or you've adjusted for feedstocks, or you've adjusted for a shutdown, or you've adjusted for any of these number of things. So it's in your interest to resubmit in those kinds of cases. And then you have just random things that happen. You can have major upsets at a plant. You can have changes in the supply chain that you're not aware about, and you find out about them afterwards, and they've impacted your process. So then you have to resubmit. You also have fun things in California, like the annual fuel performance reports, which means that you're basically redoing the CI score every year anyway. It's just labeled differently in the report. So you're checking these on sort of an annual basis. The RFS, it's more of a one and done until they decide to change something in the regulation. And then if you're north of the border in Canada, it's based on sort of a 2-year model update cycle. So each regulated environment has got slightly different rules for how often you have to do it and when you can do it sort of voluntarily.
Got it. Thank you. That's so helpful, Logan. So, do you have any closing thoughts on key takeaways you would like an ethanol producer to learn about their CI score or things you'd like them to keep in mind going into the new year on the LCA front?
Yeah, that's a bit of an interesting question. You you definitely want to have your compliance plan set in an order before you do a new CI score, because all of these measurements you're taking, you need to be able to point these out and explain why you're taking the measurement and what it's used for. And because a lot of these regulated systems now have the requirement in the third party verifier has to review your CI score, the first thing that verifier is going to ask you to do is provide them with your compliance plan. So there's sort of a stepwise process that you really do want to keep in mind. You want to set that compliance plan up. You want to do your data collection. You want good, accurate record keeping. You want all of your supporting documents and ducks in a row. You want to do your CI score. You want to engage your verification body early. And you want to consider that there's significant lag times for doing all of these things in the process. You can't just contract someone to do a CI score and it's done instantly. It takes 45 to 60 days in a lot of cases to do that work. It can take another 90 days for a verifier to then do the check. And you can be looking at 6 months to a year after that submission before somebody at the regulated body actually reviews it. So don't count that the second you submitted something, you're generating credits based on that value. You've got to plan that far enough ahead in your business process that you're not getting caught with invalid CIs for fuels you're producing and sending to those regions. So keep an eye on your calendars and plan ahead.
Thank you, Logan. That's great advice. Thank you so much for joining us today. Great chatting with you.
Pleasure chatting to you, Katie. Thank you very much.